Sometimes the universe provides. I suppose if we look at it from the perspective of someone who lives in Westeros, we should say the gods. And that's exactly what Addam of Hull does after he bends the knee to Queen Rhaenyra in front of the dragon Seasmoke, who very much chose him as his new rider. I dedicated quite a bit of time in my last video to make the point that when it comes to claiming dragons, the truth is no one knows definitively how it works. It's that way by design. There are lots of historical anecdotes thrown around, tall tales, pieces of gossip and speculation, and of course, lessons learned and passed down through the generations of Targaryen rulers that as readers or viewers, we have to filter through their interests, that very much benefit from keeping the belief in their supremacy alive. One of my favorite parts of episode 7 is when the Dragon Keepers show up before the sowing of the Dragonseeds, to function almost as surrogates for the gatekeepers of the lore. This order drank the Valyrian Kool-Aid, so to speak, and is outraged that Rhaenyra would even suggest putting filthy Andals on her family's majestic beasts. Where they're not wrong is in their assertion that House Targaryen's dragons are the last magic of old Valyria. The origins of dragons are shrouded in the same mystery as claiming them is, but magic almost has to be involved. In a recent blog post, George R.R. Martin said that more about the why and how of bonding with dragons would be revealed in his future books, and added that Septon Barth got much of it right, which sounds like an exciting detail. In my last video, I mentioned the incident when Arya Targaryen's claiming of Balerion and subsequent death after being carried off to Old Valyria led to keeping the dragons in the Dragon Pit. This is when the Order of Dragon Keepers was established, and this event also prompted Septon Barth to start researching dragons, which he eventually compiled into a book titled Dragons, Worms, and Wyverns: Their Unnatural History. And at this point, you're like, there's a book that explains it all, and the author contends that most of it's right. So why is any of this a mystery? Well, about a century after it was written, the Targaryen king Baelor the Blessed ordered Barth's writing destroyed, so that only fragments of it remain. From those, we know that Barth considered several legends about the origins of dragons. The Balerian account says that dragons sprang forth from the 14 Flames, a string of volcanoes on the Valyrian peninsula. They saw the dragons as children of these mountains of fire. Legends elsewhere make claims of a second moon that released 1,000,000 dragons when it was destroyed by the sun, and an ancient race of people that history doesn't know much about taming the dragons before bringing them to Valyria to teach its people the art of bonding with them, before leaving and then just sort of disappearing from history. All of these seem fantastical and unlikely to me the first time I read the history book, but there appeared to be several clues pointing to the conclusion Septon Barth came to as you read your way to it. He ends up speculating that the blood mages of Valyria used wyvern stock to create dragons. As you'll probably know, the Valyrians were famously practitioners of fire magic and blood magic. If you watched Game of Thrones, you'll remember that Mirri Maz Duur was a blood mage, although she likely learned the arts in Asshai since she was born long after the doom of Valyria. The takeaway about blood magic from her part of the story is that there's always a price to pay. A price of human life, which we saw through the loss of Daenerys' unborn son Rhaego, and later Mirri herself in the process of hatching Daenerys' dragons. Wyverns are creatures that still exist in the south and are very much like dragons, if not a little smaller, with one major difference: they don't breathe fire. Fireworms are creatures that don't have wings but breathe fire. They were found in the 14 Flames even before the dragons existed there. You can probably see where this is headed, and to me it didn't seem all that subtle reading The World of Ice and Fire. Take these two creatures and a little blood magic and boom, you have the perfect weapon to become the dominant civilization on the planet. Add to that Daemon song to Vermithor from Season 1 that we heard the Dragon Keepers singing in Episode 6. After its introduction, many theories circulated about how its words described the creation of the dragons and how they were bound to the Dragonlord families. It starts, fire breather, winged leader, but two heads to a third sing. Fire breather could be the worm and the winged leader the wyvern. The third would be the final ingredient, which he comes right out and says is blood magic in the next line. The fires have spoken, and the price has been paid with blood magic. Even if that's not what George R.R. Martin was referring to when he said that Septon Barth got much of it right, magic would still have to be involved because one thing about Valyrians is indisputable. In all known history, they're the only people who subjugated dragons to harness their power. And it wasn't just the Targaryens, there were 40 families that were dragon lords in Old Valyria. Whether that means that they were bestowed upon them by the gods who literally had the volcanoes give birth to them, or if they use some secret blood magic as the song suggests that they aren't sharing, to this point in history they're the only ones who've done it. And geez, that's kind of a lot to back up why the Dragon Keepers are sort of right, but it feeds into what I found most pleasantly surprising about this episode. For me, the dragons have always represented power above all else. They're the way the Targaryens, who were an insignificant Dragon Lord family in Old Valyria, became the rulers of Westeros. Because they heeded the warning of Daenerys' dream about the doom, they're the only ones that survived. And with all those more powerful families out of the way, they find themselves in a really interesting situation with the kind of technological advantage that can make you conquerors. Episode 7 is about the sowing of the Dragonseeds, or as we'll see it turn out, the Red Sowing. After being forced into a no-win situation, Jace suggests opening things up to allow more of their extended family a shot at riding their unclaimed dragons. The show changed how this plays out because they move things around in the timeline, and at this point in the book, Rhaenyra isn't doing much to lead her cause, and more or less isn't involved with a lot of the decisions. So according to Mushroom, who claims it was his idea, Jace led the effort to find riders, specifically looking at bastards who were suspected to have Targaryen blood. In the show, Myasaria takes Mushroom's lines and says them to Rhaenyra, which turns out to be a big improvement. In the book, offering to let a bunch of random lowborn people hop on a dragon to give it a go is just something that happens. Like, wow, hey, look at Jace showing some initiative and trying to make things happen. There are obviously inherent risks, but no one pushes back. In a way, it overlooks the class divide and the way people look down on the lowborn, and especially how they revile bastardy. The book can sort of just breeze by that to focus on all the graphic ways the dragons kill their would-be riders, which is compelling enough to distract you. But the show makes a really smart choice to point out what a big deal this is because of all of what I just brought up and what the Dragon Keepers were on about. Their order has an almost religious structure, so it makes sense for them to see this as blasphemy. But Jace's protestations make so much sense for his character and introduce what turns out to be the most interesting part of this episode. The fact that everyone knows that he's a bastard but under fear of death can't ever say so is something that defines his character. As he gets to point out to his mother here, when she took Harwin Strong into her bed, she risked undermining his legitimacy as her heir. Whether you agree with that or not, you can understand how this is something he's always thinking about. So having him elevating nobodies to the role of Dragon Rider like he did in the book wouldn't really make sense. His unease and his heartfelt plea to his mom to not take that claim to legitimacy to succeed her away. The fact that claiming one proves he's the blood of the dragon and essentially above anyone that might try to criticize his claim is just a great way to explore the complications involved with waging a war inside your own family, where everyone has enjoyed this elevated status based on the blood they were born with. And speaking of bastards, to fold Addam of Hull back in, what he says about if the gods call him to greater things, who is he to refuse them, is something that Rhaenyra picks up on and runs with because she's properly desperate for anything that can turn the tide at this point. It comes out when she's talking to Myasaria, and here again when she has to refuse her son's request to help him uphold his claim to legitimacy. If only they knew Addam was Corlys' son, they could actually destigmatize his situation by legitimizing him. Just make him a Valyrian and call it a day. You can see why that would have been a problem when Rhaenys and their children were still alive, but even though she urged him to raise Alan up in their last conversation, he still doesn't say anything here. He almost does when he's alone with Addam, and definitely acknowledges he's Alan's father when he goes to talk to him one-on-one, but chooses not to say anything to the other members of the Black Council at this point. I'm not entirely sure what he's waiting for, since there's been all this talk of him needing an heir, Baela declining that because she's blood and fire, and then Alan saying in this episode that he doesn't care to ride a dragon because he's salt and sea, and that's enough. Seems like we can see where that's all going, but even if they were to make the brothers legit, they would still need to go looking for Dragonseed to find riders for the remaining unclaimed dragons. So this was a great addition that let them explore Rhaenyra and Jace's relationship a little further, while pointing out how limited their choices are. They set it up well by having it still be his idea and still showing his effectiveness in the north and with the Freys, and having them reach the understanding that there aren't any other options together. That works as the setup, and we'll come back to the sowing itself because that dominates so much of the episode. But there are some developments on the green side of things, and Daemon's time at Harrenhal finally delivers its payoff. In King's Landing, the one person who has just about nothing going on in this episode is Alicent. We see her get her cut from the fish guts flinging riot fixed up by Orwyle, and find out that she'll have a scar that'll be easy to cover up that is very similar to the one she gave Rhaenyra the night Aemon lost his eye but gained his dragon. She tells the Grand Maester that her whole life she's endeavored to serve her house and the realm, and somehow none of it matters. Under the new regime, she's literally cast aside, and decides to have Sir Rickard Thorne take her to the Kingswood alone so she can just hang out for a few days. Something that she's still doing by the end of the episode. The lackeys that Aegon elevated to Kingsguard aren't so lucky. We see the two that survive stripped of their white cloaks before Aemon sends them off to take the black at the wall. Larys and Ironrod are watching this go down, and the latter mentions that he's heard news that Seasmoke has a new rider. He can't be sure who the rider is, and then they decide that it probably isn't Rhaenyra since she tried and failed before. And because there isn't much more to go on, Larys says maybe this is a whisper that's best left to the wind. Because it's Larys, though, you wonder what he's up to. And later we see that he's enlisted Orwyle to try to speed up Aegon's recovery. He walks in to see the tremendous struggle it takes to get him to walk across the room. And we see that without his bandages, the king's injuries are pretty horrific. Larys helps to get him to his bed. Tom Glencarny does an impressive job of expressing the pain he's in as he clutches the small ball Aemon left with him. And then the Master of Whispers essentially reveals that he's rushing his physical therapy because he'd rather Aemon's regency was shorter rather than longer. It makes sense. One-Eyed made it plain that he cares little for Larys, and if he can return Aegon to power, he'd be in his debt. Plus, I think he's definitely using this to his advantage, but I don't think he was being dishonest when he came to him in the last episode either. The rest of what happens in King's Landing is set in motion by the Blacks. I mentioned that Corlys went to have Alan hire some fishing vessels to wait to deliver the message for Rhaenyra about the Dragonseeds, which he eventually does. In that conversation, he confirms that he's Alan's father, while saying that the Valyrians are of old Valyria, but not dragon lords. It's an interesting thing to add beyond being a way for him to say, I know you've been thinking I'm your dad, so yeah, our people. The Valyrians married Targaryen, so they have the blood in their line, but it's far enough removed to make you wonder how far the old blood magic goes as far as claiming a dragon is concerned. This pairs nicely with Lord Celtigar telling him, all due respect to your worker, but we can't just have low-born people running around claiming dragons. And this is echoed when Rhaenyra tells Myasaria, but the highborn families are different because they share an ancient fealty based on honor, which she can pretty easily point out as BS based on her royal-born brothers currently trying to kill her and her family after usurping her throne. It could be nothing, and it could be there just to show that Corlys and Alan have more in common since they're both drawn to the salt in the sea. But it could be intended to blur the lines further about who can become dragon riders. I hope it's that, because I think the story needs as much of that as possible. Either way, Alan gets the message to Linda, and she starts to spread it amongst the known Targaryen bastards in King's Landing. At the tavern, we see Ulf's buddies try to pump him up about becoming a dragon rider, and you feel for him a little bit because there's a part of him that doesn't allow himself to believe it's all true. Of course, he's been using this story to get free booze, so his drinking partners pretty much shame him into going along with it, while getting him drunk enough to drown out those thoughts of doubt. And I think if you hadn't read the book, it would feel like it could go either way when he got to Dragonstone. The show concentrated on building Hugh up as a character by using his family and sick daughter as the window into how the small folks suffer throughout the season. It seemed like as each episode went on, his hints of silver hair were more noticeable. And in this episode, we find out that his daughter died, and he has reason to believe he'd be able to mount a dragon at the sowing. He never knew his father, but tells his wife the story of his mother who worked at a pleasure house. He says she had it better than most because of who she was, and that she did well because rich guys will pay more to sleep with someone with silver hair. When he says that she told him he was no different than her brother's boys, Viserys and Daemon, you realize this is the story of King Jaehaerys' daughter, Sarah Targaryen. This is an interesting addition to the lore that could work, but one that I never would have guessed based on his introduction in the book, and because she had known bastards that were present at the Council of 101. Sarah's story is a whole other thing, but she was Jaehaerys and Alysanne's fifth daughter. Her sexual appetites were more in line with the stories we hear about Targaryen princes rather than their sisters. And when this became apparent to the king and queen, they sent her off to become a novice of the Silent Sisters. I guess it's worth mentioning that this was after Jaehaerys slain one of her 3 lovers in a trial by combat. She eventually escaped from the Silent Sisters and made her way to Lys, where she started her career as a sex worker, before eventually relocating to the free city of Atlantis, where she became the proprietor of a famous pleasure house. According to the show, somewhere along the way she had Hugh, and he eventually traveled back to King's Landing to try to make his way with his own hands. The thing about Sarah is that her relationship with her father is one of the few dark spots in his otherwise successful reign, and something he appeared to regret in his later years. One potential dragon rider whose Targaryen blood isn't in question is Rhaenyra. We get a brief scene with her as she leaves the Eyrie, with Rhaenyra's 2 youngest sons, Viserys and Aegon. Once Lady Jane heads back to her castle, Rhaenyra takes a quick detour to look at an area where the wild dragon has feasted on some sheep. That's all we see, and the impression it leaves is that this isn't something she's planning on letting go of, even though she's leaving for Pentos. Things have finally fallen into place for her father, and the new Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, Oscar Tully, arrives at Harrenhal to treat with him. Luckily for us, he's got some of that Lyanna Mormont energy now that he's officially in charge, and does this great job of working through the mess Daemon and Willem Blackwood created with their war crimes. I like that I wasn't sure what to expect from Daemon given his strange trip at Harrenhal. After the last episode, I thought it was pretty much wrapped up, at least as far as his uncertainty over what he wanted to do once he got his army. But not being able to cow Oscar here gives him one last hurdle to clear before he can even make that a reality. You gotta love how Oscar leans into the whole, yes, you're right, I'm really green when it comes to this stuff, while going out and getting the exact outcome he knows everyone can get behind. This is bad news for Willem, but at the end of the day, his young liege lord is right. Daemon may have opened the door, but he went through it because it was what he wanted to do. It's also funny that given what we know about Daemon, delivering the justice isn't something he would lose much sleep over, even knowing that he did the Blackwoods dirty, really. I mean, cutting off a grown man's head is a minor inconvenience after you had the same done to an innocent child. And let's not forget, he sent him out to do awful things to the Bracken civilians, the wives and the children. And when Alice called him on it, he didn't really show any remorse. But having to sit there and let this kid Oscar talk shit and just take it, right there out in the open in front of everyone, that was probably hard as hell for him. I suppose it was worth it though. And his final vision with Viserys serves to show that the time he spent there has at least changed him. I do feel like there's a diminishing returns thing happening here, and it feels like this should be the last time we see him, at least in this context. And I was also a little surprised that they had Rhaenyra send Alfred Broom, but he still hasn't arrived. That would seem like a detail that wouldn't go anywhere. I guess it did serve to get him out of the small council for a while, but if he just shows up and finds everything ready to go, I'm not sure why you bother with the setup. But we'll have to wait and see what happens in the next episode, because he still hasn't really checked in with them at all, so he does need to establish contact. The decision to separate Daemon and Rhaenyra this season makes me think about where they both end up. I've seen a fair amount of complaints about this side quest, but I think it adds a lot to the character. If his answer to Viserys is no, that he doesn't want the crown anymore, where does that leave him? Most of the problems he runs into are the direct result of only doing what suits him. This is something his lover Myasaria, his brother the king, and his wife the current queen have all pointed out, and the consequences of living like that are the things that haunted him in his dreams ever since he fell under the influence of the castle or Alice Rivers and her potions. I think when you split them up like this, then you'll see each of their stories and how that changes things reflected in the other. Things didn't stop moving because he was stuck. Everything continued to change, so I think we'll all feel a little more invested in whatever he does next. So I opened with this idea that sometimes the gods provide. And in the lead up to the sowing, I thought Rhaenyra was using this as justification for her decisions more than anything else. I gotta do this thing that sounds kinda crazy, but who am I to refuse if this is what the gods have in store for me? When she actually welcomes the Dragonseeds and things start to get going, I started to wonder if we were supposed to interpret it as she was starting to get a little carried away with it. On my second watch, her using the word ordained when she was talking to Myasaria really stood out. If we think about the comparisons between the two stories, this is her assembling her army, and it starts off as normal as something like that can. I already mentioned that the Dragon Keepers walk out in protest before things get underway, and on top of what I already said, this changes the tone and makes it feel like anything might happen. As she addressed the potential riders, what I kept thinking about the most was that idea of power, and how this would affect them when they finally found themselves elevated to a place that only a day earlier would have sounded like an impossible dream, which is all underlined by Jace's conflict. Obviously, book readers knew which characters would end up successful, and I don't imagine it was much of a surprise for anyone since they had to familiarize us with Ulf and Hugh so that we would know what it meant to them. But having said that, I think they did a good job adding enough to keep everyone glued to the screen. Part of that came from what she told them. The idea that if they claimed these dragons, it would bring peace, even going as far as saying it could be done without bloodshed. I wasn't sure if we were supposed to believe that she thought that was true or not. If so, it would have been some serious wishful thinking. Like, I don't think anything in the story has set things up for her to think that, well, if we had just more power than they did, they would stop fighting. When she walks away after saying she has nothing else to tell them, and that the dragon must speak, and then goes a safe distance away while her guards are blocking the exits, I mean, what are you supposed to make of that? I thought they set this up perfectly with the scene where she calls Vermithor and then reaches out to put her hand on his face. They close their eyes together, and then the face she makes when she opens hers back up is not the look of a person who is doing all of this as a way to force her enemies to surrender. She's experiencing that feeling of power, and she knows if any of these bastards are successful, they'll also understand what that feeling is. Before anyone can do that, Vermithor decides to eat some fools, and seems to enjoy playing with his food. All of this looked fantastic to the point that if this was really the last set piece of the season, it would probably suffice. I feel like this is a different level of what they're able to do in the same way Rook's Rest was. Emma Darcy's facial acting is a nice thing to go back to while everyone runs for their lives, and I liked how you couldn't tell if Hugh was going to use that woman as cover so he could escape, or if he was going to try to be a hero, and his last stand, and just sort of realizing you can't run away, deciding to face Vermithor and essentially forfeiting his life, and then the screaming, it all works so well. You see him relax a little, and then they give it time to set in, and then you get the shot where he's making that same face Rhaenyra was making, and yeah, I suppose it's on now. We'd seen Ulf slip away, which felt like a thing he'd do, and of course he walks himself right into Silverwing. Well, he walked into a clutch of eggs first, but having these bonds all happen in different ways reinforces the idea that the dragons have personalities. Ulf thinks it's over for him, but it's really just beginning. And I guess no one will question his stories about being Balon the Brave's bastard anymore. When it cut away from him, I was a little disappointed that we didn't see either of them mount their new dragons. But they set that straight after a quick check-in with the Green Council. In that, Aemon gets a report that the Hightower host is making slow progress because they're threatened on two fronts by armies allied with House Beesbury. Justice for Lord Beesbury, who was taken out by a small ball in that very same room. But Aemon also learns that Prince Daeron's dragon, Tessarion, has at last taken to wing. So he'll be joining the fight soon, and that's another dragon for the green side. Which is good news, and he finds out how important that might be when their meeting is interrupted as Ulf flies by on Silverwing. This made me think about them deciding not to tell him about Seasmoke earlier. We know Larys has ulterior motives, but Ironrod is sitting right here, and it says a lot about how functional this government is under Aemon, who, seems to be way more decisive and focused on doing what he needs to do. But how effective can you be if you try to do it all yourself? He rushes on horseback to get to Vhagar, who appears to be recovered from Rook's Rest at this point. He tries to run Ulf down, but the old girl isn't fast enough to catch Silverwing, and he has to turn around when they start to reach the safety of Dragonstone. I'm not sure whose idea it was to go to King's Landing. As far as I could tell, Ulf was holding on for his life and didn't appear to be in control of anything, so I'm going to assume it was the dragon's idea. At the same time, I'm sure he wouldn't be upset if anyone who knew him got to see that he's a dragon lord now. The episode ends with them coming in for a landing on top of Dragonstone, while Rhaenyra looks towards King's Landing with Syrax and Vermithor behind her. She's looking a lot more powerful than she's been for this entire season, and it really does seem like this gamble has paid off for her. It made for a great episode that left me pretty excited for the finale, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.